You can have fun reading all the stuff that goes before the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like we're recording, so I will get started. Am I right, Sharon? We're good?
You're all set?
Okay.
Facebook is just starting now, so you're all good.
Okay. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to the Illinois Open Meetings Act included in Public Act 1010640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual public meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. On March 17, 2020, President Levin issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, the Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act to address the health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. On June 15, 2020, President Levin executed a written determination that given the ongoing emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings are not practical or prudent. On June 26, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a new disaster proclamation in Executive Order 2020-43 that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 50 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible in accordance with the Open Meetings Act as amended by Public Act 1010640. Governor Pritzker reissued this declaration on October 16, 2020 through a renewed disaster proclamation in Executive Order 2020-59. And on November 13th, Governor Pritzker issued his latest disaster proclamation, which has restricted in-person attendance at meetings to a maximum of 10 persons. In accordance with the governor's disaster proclamation, the village president's declaration of emergency and determination regarding in-person meetings, I hereby determine that in-person meetings of the Finance Committee are not practical or prudent until further notice. This meeting is being conducted virtually with members participating through the Zoom webinar platform. Village Manager Corrali is present in the Village Hall as required by the Open Meetings Act. You want to take the roll call, Phil?
Sure. Trustee Vree?
Here.
Trustee Miller?
Here.
Trustee Rubin?
Here.
And for the record, Trustee Hallwax and President Levin are also present.
Okay, to help facilitate this meeting, I ask each member of the committee and staff to mute your lines if you are not speaking. Members of the public are muted and should remain muted during the meeting. In accordance with the supplemental rule the board approved on April 16th, 2020, here's how public comment will be taken at this meeting. The email address and telephone number designated for the public comment for this meeting were published with the meeting agenda. In a moment, I will ask Management Analyst Deputy Village Clerk Jordan Lester to read the public comments that were submitted prior to the meeting. If anyone would like to submit a public comment during the meeting, please email your comment to glencoemeeting@villageofglencoe.org. Comments submitted during the meeting may be read at the end of the meeting. Written comments should be limited to 400 words. Management Analyst Lester, can you please, are there any public comments before the meeting?
Trustee Vree, we did not receive any public comment this evening.
Okay, so then we shall move on to regular scheduled pieces of the meeting. So we need to approve the minutes from our last meeting. Were there any comments or any changes that need to be made? All right.
I move to approve.
Second.
Phil, can you?
Trustee Vree?
Yes.
Trustee Miller?
Yes.
Trustee Rubin?
Yes.
All right. Nikki, do you want to walk us through the financial reports for the month?
You're on mute.
Thank you, Trustee Rubin. Can everyone see the PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, on tonight's agenda, we'll be reviewing the December Treasurer's Report, which will be the final financial report for STEB year 2020, officially moved into calendar year from here on out. So we'll go through some of the highlights in the general fund, the water fund, cash flow projections, and then Stella will take a turn with some of the golf club highlights. And we'll also be reviewing the community investment program, and lastly, the discussion concerning the golf club debt. Okay, jumping right into the December report. We do have some positive results given a very crazy year. So I'm glad to report that many of our revenues came in higher than what we had anticipated. Property taxes ended the year at 98.7% of budget, which is pretty typical for us. Usually we're at 97 to 98% of the levy that's extended. So with appeals and things coming in a little bit differently than what you planned for, that's exactly where you would want to be. They are higher than last year because we did increase the levy year over year, so that is also anticipated. State income tax did come in higher than last year. It actually ended the year at 107% of budget. A large reason for that is some of the economic stimulus money that was coming through and income taxes paid on those unemployment wages. Sales and utility taxes, as I'm going through this, are both lower than prior year on a cash basis. We've had many discussions about this throughout the stub year, that we did have an audit adjustment mid-year in fiscal year 20 that was kind of skewing some of the system numbers. But when you're comparing apples to apples, sales taxes was lower than prior year. The December receipt would represent sales from September, and we'll go through those in just a moment in a little bit more detail. And utility taxes are in a similar boat. On a cash basis, those were lower than prior year, but still at 95.8% of budget. One of the big drivers with utility taxes that's driving it down is our natural gas utility tax receipts. We've been fortunate in 2020 to have rather mild temperatures for our type of winter. And compared to what we would see in a normal fiscal year with a February 28th year end, we would have those January, February winter months of gas usage, and we wouldn't see that here because we cut off in December. So we do expect to see a couple larger receipts in January, February timeframe within this first quarter of the year, but at this point, we're not concerned about it. The rock star of 2020 is permit revenue. That really just came out of the sky. I don't want to say the sky, but that really came in to save the day. In November and December, we had some very strong receipts in our community development department, and that permit revenue came in at 104% of budget, higher than last year. So we really had a strong 2 months towards the end of the year.
So Nikki, question.
Yep. Mhm.
So this shows budget at 19.7 for general fund revenue. Is that right?
Correct.
So that shows us coming in 2.5 million below budget, but then all these sub numbers look close enough.
Hold on. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to, let me pull up the actual financial report because we're looking at,
I
there
mean,
still needs to
the
be
general fund
more,
revenue for budget shows 19.7 million
right?
right here.
There has to be more to that. Off the top of my head, I don't know what's making that up because these numbers they do look very strong. Hold on. Let's see here.
Were there any bond issues that we didn't do or things that we didn't do that would have generated revenue that was in the budget but wasn't actually collected?
We did scale down one of our bond issues in the water fund, but that would not be here in the general fund.
This is general fund.
Mm-hmm.
Does bond revenue show up as, does bond issuance show up as revenue?
Oh, you know what the big driver is here? We had a placeholder for use of reserves for the month of January and February, and that was over $1 million. That was like $1 million point. We have that somewhere. That's a big contributor to it because we won't receive that money.
Wait, explain that again. So this was, stub year, there was a $2.5 million placeholder, but we listed it in the budget as revenue.
It was not $2.5 million. Hold on 1 second. I'll tell you how much it was because we had it. $1 million of that difference between the two was a planned use of fund reserves that was budgeted in stub year of 2020. And that was, I think, an offset. Actually, that was an expenditure. I don't want to shoot from the cuff here. I think we're going to have to look into
Yeah, the
what's really driving for this.
$17.3 million revenue number doesn't tie to the numbers underneath it either by about $2.5 million. So I think there's some item that was affecting all of these numbers.
These numbers down here. Are you saying, Trustee Rubin?
Yeah, if you add up 1 through 6, you don't get the
Yes.
17.274 million.
There is a lot more in the general fund. These are just some of the revenues that we
Yeah.
highlight.
Nikki, I think my question is, if you look at page 16 of the packet, I wonder if something's not truing up in that 17,274 number. Because if you look at original total budget against current total budget,
Oh, no, that is it. That number's correct. It is in other financing sources. So we budgeted,
We had a gap
Sandy.
lower in other financing sources, is what you're saying.
so if you look on page 17 of the packet and you look at other financing sources, we were budgeting 2.15 as a funding source. And that was a planned use of fund reserves. And originally that was for capital. So we had talked about during the budget process to try and, ironically, try to make this more transparent. Not sure if that's what it's doing, but that we were actually going to be using fund reserves as a funding source for some of our capital. So we were trying to call out that number in our revenue budget to show that we had a funding source for that capital. It is cash reserves, but that's not cash that we will receive. So that is the lion's share of the difference between the two of those numbers that you see coming out of the system.
and that relates to canceled capital that the village board decided back in April to defer or delay.
And it's really a way of showing that we do have, in essence, a balanced budget because we are having a planned drawdown of fund reserve. So we have a funding source for those items. But to Manager Corrali's point, we didn't actually expend those funds.
And we didn't draw it down. So really, you'd have to subtract that out to be able to compare the year-to-date budget to what we would have budgeted if we didn't have that.
Correct.
So that's just a misleading figure as is.
Mhm.
Okay, so it looks like then we're about 300,000 short of budget if we're not.
Correct. Correct. And that is what we'll go through in just a moment of what makes that up or what that is comprised of.
So sorry, I was trying to find the page. So
Oh,
the
that's okay. So
that was coming from general fund, or that was just a plug that didn't mean anything, but now a plug because of the 2 months.
the 2 million. So it's on page 17 and packet page 17.
Yeah.
Let's see, it's 1, 2, 3,
390.
4 lines from the bottom in the general fund section. And you'll see that 2.1 million and there's no activity. That budget is remaining. So it's kind of artificially inflating that variance there.
Yeah, and that was to plug, just so I'm clear, that was to plug for the 2 months, is that?
No, that was capital. That was intended to be capital. That was
It
capital.
was to show the planned drawdown of fund reserve for capital. So that was the amount of capital that we were originally going to do out of the general fund. So to balance the budget, we had all these expenses. So we put this funding source in to match, to identify that
As the source.
that was a plan.
That's how it has to be accounted, is that you it's not really revenue, it's just pulling from revenue that was Or-
It's not really revenue. It was just meant to show that there was a funding source for those items.
And so
Yeah,
by
just
virtue
that-
of
and
having
that's the way public
capital
affairs was-
spending that, we left it in capital available for future years.
You can do it either way to answer your question, Chair Bree. You know, if
Okay.
you want to show that it's a deficit budget, you can show it that way too.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. Okay, so moving on to the water fund. Our water fund has had a very strong year. Both volumetric and fixed charge revenue continue to perform strong. Not only have we seen a drastic increase in usage just because folks are staying home, but we also saw quite a bit of irrigation this summer due to the dry conditions. As you have probably seen from the regular updates from the village, we're more than 85% complete with our water meter changeout process. With that new technology, we've also been able to help residents identify a number of older leaking fixtures that have led to higher water bills. And also increase our education on those activities that require quite a bit of water use. Through several conversations with residents, we've identified just a higher amount of water use related to the use of sprinklers, irrigation systems, filling pools, power washing, and even one call about very long showers that you don't necessarily realize how many gallons of water that you use. But we have seen a fairly large increase in use, not just because folks are staying home, but also some more accurate readings from the new technology. So it has been nice that we can now see daily usage and even up to hourly usage, because it does allow us to provide a higher level of customer service. When residents do call, we can identify that, you know, there's a problem at your home, and we can help them work through it. So we have seen quite a few calls on that, but we've also, as a result, seen a large increase in water revenue. I do want to caution the committee in terms of rate increases. I don't think we're at a point where we need to panic with the water fund coming in higher than what we expected. We have pumped quite a bit more water this year, so we did expect water revenues to come in higher than budget. But this is something that we would recommend that we reevaluate as part of the budget process, just to make sure once we have all of the smart meters in place and we're measuring all of the water, that we're still on track with what the water rate study had indicated where we should be. So that's something we should be evaluating annually regardless, but will be particularly important this year with the new information that we have. Any questions on the water fund? Okay. Moving on to cash flow projections. So circling back on sales taxes, while this was lower than prior year, we did still have a strong finish to the fiscal year, considering the steep drop down that we had with April sales. That was our July receipt. So taking a look at where we ended in December and our January receipt, December came in a little bit less than prior year, but October sales seem to have rebounded quite a bit. So obviously this is something we'll continue to keep an eye on, but quite candidly, these receipts are much higher than what we had expected. So they do continue to perform strong. In terms of use taxes,
One
we
question.
do have,
Yes.
sure.
Do you have a sense of, I mean, just from a, you know, health of the village standpoint, how we've made up? Is that, you know, what branch of the economy is doing this within town?
We do have some, let me go back to the categories. So if you look at packet page 21, unfortunately, this is quarterly data and we only get it once it's updated by the Department of Revenue, but we do have some categorical data that show how things are performing quarter over quarter. And if you look at the most recent quarter, July through September 2019 compared to 2020, food is slightly down, drinking and eating places is slightly down. Automotive and filling stations is up, which I wouldn't, you wouldn't necessarily expect, understanding that folks are at home more, but that is what the numbers are showing here. Drugs and miscellaneous retail, that's kind of your, I don't want to be too specific here, but more of the generic retail stores, like non-food items that would have sales tax charged to them. And then
So-
there's also, oh, go ahead. What was your question? I'm sorry.
So it looks like it's auto.
It does look like it's auto that's driving it.
I mean, we've never had a quarter.
That's been that high.
And that tracks with national and regional figures that showed that auto had a dramatic comeback as we progress along through the year, where it was down a great deal back in March and April and May. So the auto figures that Nikki is showing, I think, fit very closely to what we saw on the national scale.
I think an interesting point also is when you look at eating and drinking places and things like that, when you compare year to year, 2019 to 2020, obviously, we only have the July to September is our last quarter. But, with the COVID mitigations that were in place, that they performed as well as they did despite that, I think underscores the strength of the local economy on a few levels. And I think it ties with what we're seeing and what we're hearing from the business community, that while there are challenges, no doubt, significant challenges imposed through the various phases of the reopening plan here in Illinois, that our businesses are still being supported by the community and the broader community at large. So, Nikki and I have talked about this. I think as we look at these numbers, it'll be interesting to see the next quarter that we'll have next month. That will provide, I think, a little bit more insight as we tipped back into some more stringent mitigation that kicked in later in the fall, and how that may have impacted. But in some of the conversations I've had with some of our retailers, they noted that 2020 was as good a year as they've seen up against other years. And part of the reason was people were home all year. A lot of the retailers see a dip in the summertime months that they didn't see this year, with fewer people traveling. And so that's certainly anecdotal, and it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but I think it underscores that despite everything, we're seeing a fairly resilient local economy.
Okay. Any other questions on sales tax? Okay. So use taxes have been performing strong all year. In January, they came in slightly less than last year. We are expecting to see this trend continue. So I did talk to President Levin about ways that we could show the difference, or I guess the aggregated revenue between sales tax and use taxes, because we will start to see a shift where sales taxes trend down slightly, or use taxes trend down slightly, and sales taxes start to go up. And that has to do with some of the destination-based sourcing that the Department of Revenue is switching to starting January of 2021. So we're not sure how this is going to impact these revenues at this point because this is brand new legislation. So this is something we'll have to keep an eye on as we move through the year. So we should start to see one category go up and one category go down. So we'll start to graph those together. In terms of income taxes, those are continuing to perform strong. January had a $92,000 receipt compared to $61,000 last year. So we're hoping that that would continue with the extended stimulus. And then lastly, we referred to this earlier with the projected loss estimate. The newest, latest, greatest number is projecting at $319,000 under budget. The primary drivers of that loss include the deferred places for eating tax that was previously budgeted, those property taxes that were received less than budget. There was $100,000 budgeted for sale of assets. Those were for trade-ins on equipments that we did not move forward with. Those were part of those items that were deferred in response to the COVID pandemic. There was also some state grant funding that we're still waiting on that was related to the Safe Routes to School program. That program, we did not expend funds in stub year 20. So we expect to see that funding in calendar year 21. And then lastly, one of the larger categories contributing was violation revenue, mostly because we have a significant decrease in traffic, and therefore you have much less parking violations as a result. So those are the primary drivers of that projected loss estimate. Are there any other questions on the treasurer's report for December?
So I don't mean to, sorry, we don't have to go too much, but if I'm adding up all the sales tax numbers, it's more than $40,000, the shortfall.
Hold on.
So if you look at just June and March, year over year, that's down 12.
So this is not the entire year.
Now I'm looking at the page, whatever page it was.
Oh, I don't have that in here. Hold on, let's go back. So there's a combination. This 319,000 projected loss estimate is the aggregation of both revenues that are coming in above budget and revenues that are coming in below budget. So when I say 319,000 from a revenue loss estimate, that's a net number. So I'm not aggregating all of just those revenues that came in under budget. We have some revenues that performed very strong in the general fund. Building permits are one of them. Use taxes is another.
I was just thinking sales tax. I'm just surprised
Okay.
at how quickly things have come back. And so looking at it, if you look at sales tax, sorry, the page with the bar chart with the pie chart. And again, I'm just sort of quickly looking at it, but January through March of 2019 was 400,000. In 2020, it was 388. Then it was 524 to 360, so down 160,000. And then it's 529 to 508. So it's still 140,000-ish below. And we're only showing 40,000 below up at the. Am I making sense?
I'm trying to follow, looking at our fund projections here. Because oh, it's not it.
I guess maybe our prior year to date. I don't know.
Well, the sales taxes on the slide are only part of the stub year sales tax. Begins in June, not in March. So if we're talking about for the total year, these figures won't key out to what we did for the total year.
So if you're looking, let me see if I can, if I drag this over, can you see the spreadsheet? No.
No.
Okay, so if you look on packet page 30, sales tax is the second line item down. And this is kind of what we had talked about earlier this year. If you look at the sales tax actual numbers, you have 181,000 in March, 131 in April, and so on. So the total receipts and sales taxes for the year was $1.4 million, 1,459,717. And then when you look at the budget, there are the first month of March came in above budget, April came in above budget, and then May we started to see these drop off. Now in August, we have this kind of outlier of this negative 246. That was that audit adjustment that we had that problem with. Because that was done mid-year in fiscal year 20, the system automatically budgeted a negative in the month of August. We fixed that problem, but unfortunately we have to deal with it right now because it's hard coded into the system. So if you add all of, it's hard to look at it month by month for that reason. But if you add all of the budget numbers up, including the adjustments, the fully audited budget number, I guess, is 1491. So if you look at 1,491,000 and you subtract out what we actually received of 1,459,000, that gets you to the difference of 31,668. Now it's still less than last year.
So prior year is almost 1.6.
1.6. So you're right there. I mean, it is a drastic, relatively drastic drop from the prior year.
But it was
But
budgeted that way.
it was budgeted that way.
We don't forget we were on a 12-month to a 10-month back to a 12 again. So there is some variance because of that. Jonathan, if you're looking at the page that's on the screen right now, I don't know if we made this clear. This is not highlighting all of the months of the stub year budget. It's only highlighting 7.
I got that.
Yeah.
Okay. It looks better than it is. Like it looks like we almost made up all the difference from the bad months.
We did.
Right.
But not relative. I mean, if you're comparing a year over year, we didn't.
Correct.
Right. Comparing year to year, but I think if you compare to budget is what I think surprised us, frankly.
Right.
We just budgeted much lower. I just don't remember. We just budgeted much lower for what we would expect.
Because it was only 10 months.
But I'm only
2 months.
looking at, but I thought what you just showed us, the 1.6, that's 12 months versus 10. Sorry to be.
Oh no, you're right. You're right. The 1.6 is full 10 months.
So so the drop there is.
I think we were anticipating the months of, so once you get into January and February, that's because of the sales tax delay. October sales, November sales are typically higher compared to other months because of the holiday season. So you start to see those monthly tax receipts go up a little bit. So those were shaved off. We didn't have January and February budgeted in this stub year, those months of sales. So January, February sales tax receipts would have been for October and November in the stub year. So we wouldn't have budgeted for January, February, because that's now part of the calendar year. So that's part of the reason for the drop off. Because if you're looking, I guess looking month to month, I don't know how else to explain that.
So are we missing our two, we're missing our two biggest months? Is that what happened from a sales tax perspective?
Well, it's unfairly weighted. In January, February, and March, if you're looking at an annualized receipt, when we were trying to budget for 10 months of the fiscal year, it's difficult to determine how the sales are going to lay out. But the reason why it kind of dropped off there, because a normal sales tax year, we'd be looking at 1.9, 1.8. So that 1.6 was less. But the difference between the 2 years, I think that's just budgeting and a budgeting error,
Okay.
being
it just seems like
conservative.
Because we're looking at apples to apples, the 10 the 1.6 to 1.4.
Mhm.
So we're just the budgeting.
Budgeting, and we were also expecting some vacancies at the time that we budgeted for stub year 20.
I was going to say, I think we have to go back to, the projections that we built into the creation of both the fiscal 20 and stub year 20 budgets to fully explain those numbers. But I'm digging back into my brain as to when we were developing the stub year budget, and the expectations on sales tax there were some new vacancies in the downtown. We were going to have a full year of vacancy of Walgreens, which was certainly impacting us. And I think there was a conservative application of overall sales tax budgeting as we built the budget. So I think as we go back right now and try to think back 18 months ago, it is somewhat complicated to guess, so to speak, as to what all of those assumptions were that went into the creation of those numbers. I think the budget that was approved at 1.491 million was built off of a set of assumptions at that time. And I think the performance this year up against that is to some degree as important as how it compares to a prior year. But we can go back, Trustee Vree, and dig up some of that information just as a means of helping to better explain it, and can do that on Thursday night at the board meeting if you'd like.
We don't need to do that. I just looking at it, it looks really, like noise. It doesn't look like we went through a recession. And so that was what prompted me just looking at the numbers. If we came in expecting, call it a local recession, and instead we got a national one that sort of made it look like what we budgeted, okay. I just because it almost looks, looking at these numbers, you wouldn't notice anything happened this year, which could be a good thing. I mean, it's we budget. If I remember, we had a balanced budget, so that's a good thing. It just surprises me, and so that's why I was, sort of looking at the detail of it.
I think there's some interesting things that happened this year that perhaps might not happen in a normal year. And one of which is people were home a lot more, from the standpoint of not traveling, from the standpoint of being around. And I think there was a real sense of civic pride that we saw with a lot of residents who were shopping local and perhaps might not have shopped as local. I don't disagree with you when you look at it at the end of the year, but I think if we had, as we were worried when we sat down in April about what the potential might be, and we saw a few of those months come in so dramatically low, those April sales were dismal. And thankfully, that didn't hold.
But it agreed, except that we didn't make up the difference. And here it looks like we made up the difference. And we went into it budgeting arguably too conservatively.
It could be, yep.
So that's all. Okay. We can move on. Sorry to make it.
Okay. Are there any other questions on the report? Okay. Okay, at this point, I will turn it over to Stella to give the golf club update.
Hello, everyone. Just briefly, we did have our first Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club board meeting last week. It was a very successful meeting. The 4 board members that we have committed had never met each other before, so it was a chance for each other to get to know each other a little bit and to actually see what the other person looked like. We reviewed the Campbell and Company work that's been completed thus far, and also discuss strategies for moving forward, recruiting additional board members, and attempting to keep this momentum going that has been started with some external interviews that we've done through Campbell and Company. Part of that is our Centennial Celebration. So the golf club was first built in 1921. This is our 100-year anniversary. We have quite a few things planned at the golf course to help celebrate that. We're rolling out a Centennial logo that will be incorporated in all of our soft goods at the golf club. And we're also doing special events every month and an outing also to commemorate it. The Golf Academy, there's been a lot of changes as far as what we can and can't do with gathering and summer camps in particular. So we've been discussing the best way to move forward with our camps to keep everyone safe, and some new staffing structures in order to keep everyone separated. Just anticipating that there's still going to be some hesitancy for gathering. And that's the golf report.
Okay.
Stella,
Yes.
I first played on the golf course in 1951, so should we have a replaced divot week as a commemorative?
We should. You need to come back out and see if you can recapture your youth.
It may not be easy.
Okay, so move on to CIP.
Yep. Okay, I'll turn it over to Assistant Finance Director Joseph to provide this update.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. What is presented on the slide is the January CIP update. This does include projects that are included in the calendar year 2021 budget. There are a couple projects included on Thursday evening's board meeting agenda for your consideration. They are highlighted in kind of that orangey yellow color that's showing up on your screen. The first one the board will consider this Thursday evening is a contract agreement for professional engineering and field services. This is for the MWRD long-term inflow and infiltration control for a total amount not to exceed $96,400. In addition, you'll be asked to consider a contract for the purchase of a Vactor sewer vac truck. This is for a total cost, including a trade-in of the current unit, for a total amount not to exceed $400,694. This is a piece of vehicle that was deferred from last year. Any questions on this slide before we move on to the next? Okay. The second slide, this is a new report that accompanies the first spreadsheet. Similar to the first slide, this outlines the calendar year CIP projects and when staff is proposing board's consideration. What's different here is the columns to the right that kind of lays out when the funds are expected to be expended based on quarters. These are just, I'd like to mention that these are just estimates at this time. The plan is to update this monthly in addition to the detailed CIP schedule on the first slide. With this being a new report, we are looking for any feedback or suggestions you may have on anything you'd like to see additional or anything to eliminate. and opening this up to the committee.
I like this. I would say one thing, I don't know if, so board consideration, so just as an example, if we look at the ERP, where we've approved it in June of 18, but then have 200,000 going out this quarter. I don't know if there's a way, an easy way just to say what's been approved a long time ago, and it's just the calendar of spending versus what's newly approved and newly expended. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what we could do is just kind of add a column here that says, maybe call it multi-year, similar to the one previous on the previous slide, and just include that dollar amount in there.
You might also think about whether or not is it easier for people to read if, however it is that it's otherwise listed within a group, if you had it by board consideration date or by funds expenditure date. But I think maybe board consideration date, might make it a little easier for us to organize our thoughts as we're reviewing things.
Yeah, absolutely. Simple enough to do. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. This concludes my report, and I'll turn it back to Finance Director Larson.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the last item of our agenda to talk about the Glencoe Golf Club debt forgiveness. So included in your packet is a memorandum providing some background for this item, but just a quick summary. The Glencoe Golf Club has been part of the village since 1921, and it operates as an enterprise fund of the village. For the most of its existence, the golf club has sustained its own operational costs. However, for a period of time beginning around 2001, the village provided various forms of support to the golf club made up of several components. The first of which being several cash advances, the total of which is now currently $960,006. This was over a period of years in which the golf club could not sustain some of its operating expenses and some outstanding debt payments. And then the other component would be management fees that were recorded in the general ledger as an amount due and payable by the golf club to the village's general fund, an amount receivable in the general fund of the village. And that currently totals $549,320. During the period of time between 2007 through February 28th of 2020, the village did record management fees on the ledger, but did not actually collect them. And then in stub year 2020, based off of discussions with the board during the budget process, we did collect a $20,000 management fee from the golf club in December. But that $549,000 amount does remain outstanding. And lastly, the last component of the outstanding debt would be interest charges that have been charged on the outstanding balance of the debt owed to the village from the golf club. This is calculated on an annual basis. And the rationale of the village board many years ago was to charge interest based off of the amount of interest that the village's main checking account was earning, understanding that there is an opportunity cost had that money been in the village's checking account rather than loaned out. So those three components added together total to a total outstanding debt of $1,855,895. So as all of these amounts were paid, they were recorded on the general ledger and remain outstanding. So this 1.855 million is outstanding in the general fund of the village as a receivable, an amount to be received, and then in the golf club as an amount that's owed. It's an outstanding debt. Okay, so during the budget process last year, we started talking about this outstanding debt, and the village board indicated its willingness to forgive this debt. So based on the discussions with the board, we've consulted both our financial advisor and our auditors, and there were several criteria that they laid out that would have to be included in a potential forgiveness schedule. And those included a formal review, discussion, and approval of the forgiveness plan by the village board, an acknowledgement that the golf club cannot afford to repay this debt, and it's no longer a viable receivable on the village's general fund balance sheet, and that any forgiveness of debt be allocated over a specific period of time. And then the speed of forgiveness must occur over a number of years as to not detrimentally affect the fund balance in the village's general fund. Two of the time periods that were thrown out or recommended by the village's consultants was a 10-year forgiveness plan and a 15-year forgiveness plan, which is set out before you and amortized over equal installments. And also this is included in your packet as well. And based on this criteria, we took a look at the general fund balance and what this potentially could mean over a period of time through 2025. The reason why we picked 2025 is that we have relatively recent financial projections through that time period, and we feel fairly comfortable at this point with those projections. The numbers that you see here are slightly different than your packet. These have been updated. The projected fund balance in this column on the left, the 7 million, represents the December projected fund balance number that's in the monthly treasurer's report, also included in the packet, less this $1 million placeholder that we know we're going to draw down in the month of January and February. That was the dollar amount that we discussed as part of the budget process that we will need for cash flow purposes while we wait for property taxes to come in. So we thought this 7 million would be a good starting number. Working from left to right, looking at calendar years now, this number, this figure represents what we are projecting for fund balance if nothing were to happen at all, or if the board were to move forward with a 10-year write-off schedule, what that fund balance would be, that would be in this column. Or if we were looking at a 15-year write-off schedule, that would be in this column, what the fund balance would be looking at. And obviously that's slightly higher as the annualized payment is slightly less over 15 years. Looking at the general fund balance policy, there is criteria included in that policy that says the fund balance should be no less than 15% of operating expenses or 2 months of expenses, which is slightly higher there. So we're showing both of these dollar amounts as essentially what the floor would be for the general fund. Now, this is something that we might want to talk about with the committee in the long run of whether or not 15% or 2 months are still a viable measurement tool, but this is what exists today. So this is kind of the guideline that we have as of right now.
So if the golf club is saying they can't pay their debts, but then we are still allowed to spread out the forgiveness over 15 years, even though we know when they say that right off the bat, that it shouldn't be considered a general fund balance because we're not going to get it.
We can do that. One of the things that we talked about with the financial advisor was having a stipulation in a forgiveness plan that as the loan is forgiven, that one of the criteria is that the golf club is still financially viable each year, and that in exchange they pay either a management fee or we have some other type of measurement, whether it's a revenue sharing percentage, to ensure that we're on the right path, that there's essentially an exchange transaction there that we will write off the debt, provided that the golf club remains financially sustainable. But
And-
yes, you are allowed to do it over a period of time.
And is there a reason not to spread it out more? I mean, just 15 versus 10, if we're considering those two options.
I don't know that there's any magic in the years of 15 versus 10. Just dependent on how quickly we'd like to dispose of it. I don't know that we would want to go much longer than that,
No, that-
based off of conversations with the fundraiser for the golf course.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. So the reason we're doing this is to help with fundraising. Does it matter? I mean, how is that affected by this?
I could jump in here, Nikki.
Thank you, Stella.
Our Campbell and Company consultant only indicated that it had to be addressed, that when you're trying to, I guess, pursue large donors or any type of donor, really, having debt on your books is a red flag. And that's what most people who are philanthropically minded, that's what they look at. They want to ensure that their donation is going towards the project and not paying awful debt. So this is the recommendation and company that it is addressed. They did not say that it had to happen in a 5-year period. It just had to be addressed, and we had to have a method and something formally written that the debt would be addressed.
Okay.
A couple things. Nikki, first of all, thank you for the changes that you made to this schedule after our call today. I appreciate those. I will note that the line at the bottom for 2025, I don't think the numbers got pushed all the way down, at least in the projected general fund balance column. That number didn't get adjusted.
Oh, okay.
But in general, this is helpful. I will tell the rest of you that the way I view this as a couple of thoughts. First, that we are with these numbers and the presentations and all the rest of this because of historical reasons. We even have a different presentation about golf club numbers to the finance committee and the board generally than we do the water fund, and yet they're both enterprise funds. And there's no particular, as a newcomer, reason why, looking at things today, you would say, why do I need different presentations? Why aren't the presentations similar? Maybe is the better way to put that. And that's another topic to think about, whether or not we want to change the financials generally so that where we're addressing the water fund in our other financial packet, we see the parts of the golf report that would be equivalent in the same light. Because to me, it's the same kind of a thing from our perspective. But I think historically, we talk about the golf club as though, it can't afford to pay this debt, or it's self-sustaining, or it's making a profit, et cetera. I mean, really, at the end of the day, for historical reasons, this wasn't part of the park district. It's part of the village. But my real estate tax bill includes taxes for the park district. The park district as a whole is not self-sustaining with their various and sundry revenue activities. That's okay. We pay for that. We want those things. We want the golf club. There are times when we may have to, quote, pay for the golf club to continue to exist. And there are other times when, for various reasons, on an operational basis, it may be more profitable. That's great. But this is a gem of the village, and we want to continue it, and we want to improve it. So we're here somewhat out of history in terms of the presentation of all of this financial information. But I look at it as, if people want the books to change, the accounting records to change, in order to help drive our ability to raise private funds for the golf club and the building, and at the same time not mess up the general credit rating of the village, that as long as we're putting those two things and we're not doing any harm, whatever works best, if that's 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, it really is irrelevant. We're going to get to the same place. I look at another element that we really haven't touched on, though, as important in this process. And I think it may be important in the process of making a determination that the golf club can't afford to pay the debt or any chunk of it or any material chunk of it. It's sitting on an amount of cash that coincidentally, and it's purely coincidentally, happens to be about the same number as the existing debt. But you say, yeah, but it's January, and guess what? We have bills to pay. And after, even when before golfers come, we have a lot of work to do with the course, et cetera. And we have just talked about the fact that we're intending the board to approve about $400,000 or so, in particular, as part of the capital improvement projects that affect the golf course, which will later generate more revenue. So the golf course needs a chunk of money. If you look at it from a zero-based budgeting concept and say, how much money should we have to do the things we know we're going to be spending money on? And then whether they're operational now when we have no revenue, and then I guess it's technically really is a rainy day fund, because if it's raining, people aren't golfing. So you need to have some reasonable amount of money on top of all that to, just in general, separate and apart from the golf club building, you'd want to have money in an account so the golf club keeps paying its bills on time. And then you're also saying, look, we're embarking on this project. We have to hire consultants, maybe architects, maybe engineers, all before we can do any kind of real fundraising or before we could go do a bond raise to get this building done. And I think we ought to ask to see in future meetings some numbers that kind of tell us how much money should that be. And the board ought to be presented with that and make a recommendation about, yeah, we think that's about right. Because if it turns out, on the one hand, maybe we're underwater and whatever is in there is woefully inadequate, we should be planning as to how to fund the gap. And on the other hand, if it turns out, well, actually that total comes up, and again, I'm pulling numbers out of thin air, has nothing to do with reality. But if on the other hand, you said, oh, you actually have $500,000 of extra cash there, even after all those items you just rolled through, Gary, it's $500,000 more than that amount. Well, then, maybe there should be some transfer back to the village. Or we should otherwise at least contemplate how we're planning on spending those funds and have transparency with our residents as to what our intention is for those funds. But what I fear is somebody that comes on and just looks at the agenda packet and pulls information down, financial information down about our village, and they see, oh, here's all this information about the village and this fund, that fund, the water fund, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now here's a complete separate set of financials for the golf club. And here we have receivables and payables going back and forth between the general fund and the golf club. It makes it look like the golf club isn't part of the village and isn't really a subsidiary, to use the corporate analogy, where it is. So I think we'd be more transparent to everybody, which I think hopefully would improve our ability to raise funds privately. And I don't think any of this would be a surprise to the people that rate our bonds. If we kind of changed the presentation and had the backup to say, what kind of resources should we have sort of earmarked, if you will, or set aside and left in the golf club bank account versus what should, if anything, move to the village, or what should the village expect to add to the golf club's account over some period of time to cover the negative gap. Sorry to be so long-winded.
Trustee Rubin, thank you. And actually, after we just going through some of your questions today, I did have a conversation with Stella, and we do have some things to show you. Before I hand it over to Stella, I just wanted to circle back really quickly because we kind of stopped abruptly there. But Chair Vree did touch on this. Part of the reason why we are having this conversation this evening is really driven by the fundraising for the golf clubhouse. And understanding that since we will be seeking private donations for these improvements, it is beneficial for the golf club to have that outstanding debt waived. That being said, that would create an influx of assets to the golf fund. And arguably, the outstanding amount of just shy of $1.9 million is higher than what we would consider necessary for the absolute minimum operating fund balance in the golf club fund. And I'll turn it over to Stella in a moment so she can provide a little bit more detail on that. So there is a question before the board or before the committee for debate of that excess dollar amount, and is that earmarked towards the project? Does that lessen the burden of the residents for dollars that would be required for this project, or earmark for future capital improvements at the course, or so on, or any of the options that you just mentioned, Trustee Rubin? So if it's okay with the committee, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Stella to provide a little bit more background in terms of what a minimum fund balance would look like for the golf club.
Thank you. So the golf club and the golf business, especially in the Midwest, is a very interesting business to manage. We only have a positive NOI 5 months out of the year. So we created a minimum fund balance based on 16 months. If we were to have a 25% decrease in budgeted revenues, and we had a minimal spending of $150,000 for our capital, which is necessary every year. That's the absolute lowest we can go on that. At the end of the year, we would be in a negative $373,000. And then when you go into your next year, you're not going to start seeing a positive cash flow until May. So the first 4 months out of the year are budgeted to be negative. So you're really looking at 16 months that you kind of have to cover as our rainy day fund. So looking at what we budgeted this year, that would be about 45% of our operating budget, which would be necessary. It's about $783,000. So that's if we see a 25% dip in budgeted revenues, plus covering the expenses for the first 4 months of the following year, plus spending $150,000 in capital. So it's 45% of our operating expense, which would be what we need for our minimum fund balance. On top of that, when Denise was reviewing the capital needs for the golf club, we have quite a bit that's already budgeted and earmarked for capital improvement projects. These are projects that we have on the books for this year, and we're not even considering some of our higher ticket items that are going to come hand in hand with moving forward with the clubhouse project, namely architectural fees, things of that nature that we have the money and we should keep the money to be able to pay for it out of the golf club fund. So we don't have to look to outside sources until that fund, it gets depleted to that 45% for the minimum cash. So there's quite a bit of capital that's budgeted for this year. And then everything that we have expense-wise that's earmarked for moving forward with the clubhouse projects really absorbs the remainder of what's left in that fund at this point. Albeit this year was also a very good year for the golf club, a very unusual year. So we had a big jump in our fund balance, which is wonderful. It's 11,000 round swing from last year. that's a lot of rounds. So, you know, the golf course business fluctuates quite a bit, and you know, keeping that 45% in the fund balance is safe. It's also a number that I looked at in April when we were closed, and I didn't know when we would reopen. How long would it be before we ran into trouble? And thankfully that we have that fund balance in there. I mean, thankfully we were able to reopen, but if we weren't, we would be able to take care of all of our expenses and necessary payroll and capital and, you know, building maintenance. So it's not money that isn't earmarked in one way or the other. There's definitely not an abundance of cash that is not earmarked for, you know, future capital projects and or just operating expenses in general. Is there any questions on that? I hope everyone understood the methodology, but I'd be happy to review.
Well, I personally appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. And again, this was, I think the genesis of this was a conversation that I had with Nikki just this afternoon. So I really appreciate you being able to provide that information so quickly.
Absolutely.
And I would ask that maybe we could get a little more detail on it.
Sure.
You know, in terms of how those numbers actually shake out.
Sure.
Because it's back of the envelope. What I was hearing is that operationally, you're saying that you should have about $775,000 just to cover a 25% dip in revenue, $150,000 of capital expenses, and the fact that your business does only generate revenues 5 months out of the year. And in terms of where we're at, we're sort of at the top of that sliding scale right now.
Correct.
So that makes sense. And I remember, if I'm remembering the numbers off the top of my head, we've got about $400,000 or so of CIP that we're intending to spend on some necessary projects, some appropriate projects. So, you know, again, that gets you to like $1,175,000. And now you're saying the other, whatever that number is, again, off the top of my head, about $700,000. In point of fact, there are other projects and fees that you anticipate, either fees with regard to the club that you're likely to have to expend for consultants, architects, engineers, or others, not coming out of revenues raised in one form or another, and all of which is fine, and possibly some other capital projects. But I think we should just see that all laid out.
Sure.
And then everybody can see it and approve it. I personally don't have any problem with any of those.
I'd be happy to put that together.
But I think that to me is the way I look at it. I look at the accounting, and you're, you know, speaking as a, you know, recovering accountant, if you will, although I was never a licensed CPA. I took the exam and all that nonsense. So, you know, accounting is my background academically. And I look at that as whatever we say it is, to make sense to people, to assure them that we're not going to play any games, that we're going to be extremely straight, transparent, and open with people that make contributions, and frankly, and with the voters, to the, you know, to the extent we're going to them in the future on a referendum in terms of how bond funds would be, so that they know their money goes to the new building and not to somehow pay antecedent debt. I'm completely on board with that. It makes 100% sense. But that's separate and apart from then saying, okay, what should this number be? And if you had come back and said, actually, this number needs to be $3.5 million if you're going to do this and do it right, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not suggesting you do that. Again, to pull a number out of thin air. Then you'd be saying to the village, here's what we have, but here's what we need. And if we're going to go do this, let's figure out how to plan on funding it. You know, it as opposed to just assuming that the number in the account is right because it is. So I think we just want to treat this like we treat other things. That's all.
Okay.
I would mention that the buildup in funds that got us to what Stella just explained is something that prior boards had intended to occur. One of the reasons that there wasn't a payment of the management fee to the village was because it was thought if we're going to be able to figure out how to fund the building of the new clubhouse, which is essential because the old one is in fact falling down and irreparable at this point, it was necessary to have a sufficient amount of funds in Stella's account, not only to run the course as she explained it, but to be able to pay for some of those initial fees for architects, engineers, and help in raising the money, et cetera, the things that it's being spent on. And so none of this has really happened by accident. The only question this past year, they went ahead and paid the fee. I'm not sure based on what prior boards had thought they should have done that, but at this point, I was satisfied we're about to look at the entire thing and figure out how to move it forward. So I wasn't particularly opposed to just doing that for the purposes of moving forward and trying to figure out what to do about forgiveness on the rest of this fee. But given that, I think it's very important for us to figure out how to put the golf course in the best position to go out and both fundraise and to be in a position where the need for us to go for funds from a bond issue are put into their proper perspective. So I think what is being suggested in terms of forgiveness in that is very good and very important. And I think we need to recognize we may need to put more funds from the village in terms of liquid assets into getting the golf course through the next several years as this all comes to fruition. And that was also something that prior boards had anticipated. The only other question I have.
And to your last point, President Levin, that's exactly why I was positing that it's not just about saying, oh gosh, we need to scrape some of that money back from our left pocket to our right pocket, from the golf fund to the general fund, but also to consider seriously the question of if funds will be needed, what do we anticipate, and how will we come up with that and work it through the rest of our budgetary process. And so that's why I posed it both ways.
Correct. And in effect, we need to be moving much more to the water fund approach, in which we understand the village, if we have to build a new water plant, that's not going to come out of the water fund. The village has got to put money in for that. And that same thing is true of producing the new clubhouse. The only other question I had was, should we be taking 10 years, and do our financial people think it's important to take as much as 10 years, for example, to cancel the debt? The reason I ask that question is at some point we may say, gee, having even a schedule and having said it's all going to be canceled still is hurting fundraising. And I pose that to Stella and to Nikki as to whether we should be considering any schedule different from waiting as long as 10 years.
As far as it relates to fundraising, there is no difference between the 10 or the 15-year plan. As long as there is a plan in place and it's a formal plan that can be referred to, that's sufficient. So the years do not matter for the fundraising purposes.
Okay.
From a financial perspective, after talking to our financial advisor, they recommended 10 years just because of the sheer volume of that dollar amount, writing off a $1.8 million debt. That's a large dollar, and considering the village has a normal practice of drawing down fund balance for capital on top of that, that drastic drawdown of general fund balance is not viewed upon favorably by the rating agencies. So the more that we can smooth that out over time and show that it's part of a written plan and that we're sticking to the written plan, the better off we are.
Yeah, I would say unless there's a downside to spreading it out over 15 years, I'd be more in favor of that. Just from how the fund balance looks. But I do have a question. So one, I agree with what Gary and Larry said about trying to include golf sort of similar to the water fund when we look at overall financials. But then also, I just have a question. So how many, we don't talk about the fund balance. I sort of think of the fund balance as being cash, but it's obviously not. So are there other things in the fund balance that aren't exactly worth what we pose them as?
If you can see me in the little tiny box, I'm smiling because Nikki and I just had this conversation a little earlier.
Nikki, you're muted.
So, yep, I'm unmuting. Thank you. Okay, so we did just have this conversation today, so I'm fresh on this question. So fund balance, so that here's kind of an odd difference or the strange idiosyncrasies between government accounting and private accounting. There's cash balances, which is what you actually have in the bank, and we do report on that in the treasurer's report. And then there's fund balance, and fund balance is adjusted by assets and liabilities. In the general fund, because of the way we do accounting in government, the general fund is based off of current resources only. So when you look at fund balance in the general fund, not only is that cash and investments, but there's other current assets in there, and it's reduced by current liabilities. So that's the government way of doing things. Then in the golf club, because it's an enterprise fund, that is run more like a business. So it's a fully adjusted, fully audited fund balance. It's more like what you would see in terms of equity. So you have your cash balance, it's adjusted by current assets, it's adjusted by long-term assets. The golf club has a significant amount of dollars invested in fixed assets just by the nature of being a course. Then there's long-term liabilities, mostly due to the village. So on paper, when you look at the actual position of the golf club in the CAFR, they have a net position of 1.6 million. But because they have a payable of 1.9 million to the village, and there's other numbers that affect this, their unrestricted assets are actually negative. So what we're hoping to do as part of kind of unwinding this is truly show that component of fund balance that's spendable. So even though it's kind of convoluted to get to the bottom line, we do have classifications within fund balance that show you what you actually have available to you come worst case scenario. So the numbers that we show here and the general fund balance number, this is actually unrestricted spendable fund balance. So that's either cash or current assets that could be liquidated within 60 to 90 days that we could actually use for ourselves. In the golf club, that's a little bit more complicated because there is so much tied into fixed assets and because we have this large outstanding liability. So even though they have about 1.8 million in cash and investments, it's pretty much tied up with this outstanding liability. So that's kind of the complication when you're trying to fundraise to show, we've really worked hard to build this cash balance, but it's due and payable to the village.
So just so saying that so we're pulling down general fund balance because we're going to write off the debt, but we're calling that debt as actually usable money when the money is at the golf course, it's not usable. So it's not really usable. If you're calling it a current account, I mean, it's a receivable that we weren't going to receive effectively. And so the reason I think when we talk about that, and you mentioned it earlier, these minimum fund balance targets, we're basing those off of a general fund. Now, if if we got down to 2 months of expenses at 2.5 million and 1.8 of it was money that we didn't really have access to, that's putting our minimum balance at $700,000. And that seems really, really, really low. So, that's where I think if we talk about minimum fund balance, we ought to be careful in terms of what we're calling fund balance. If we're not going to, this isn't going to happen, but dire circumstances, we're trending at that minimum balance. It actually is a worse situation than what we're really showing.
This number does not include any amounts payable to other funds. So it does not include the golf amount. So the number that we're showing here for fund balance, and I guess I should have changed this title, is unrestricted fund balance. So the items that would be included in here are cash and investments.
So then why does it come down when we write off the debt?
Oh, you're right. I guess it would be restricted. So
I was going to say, Nikki, I think that number does include it.
it might include it. Okay.
Well, I'm not, it doesn't change anything. I just, if we need to talk about our minimum fund balance, then we ought to know what really is in the fund balance and truly is, current. And we have that somewhere in the report, but we might want to use that rather than just the overall general fund balance as where we base our minimums. If there are other, what we're calling current accounts that we can't actually spend if something were to really happen.
Jonathan, I think you're pointing to an aspect of this discussion that perhaps wasn't the intent of tonight's specific conversation, but really has been among our internal discussions about a need for a review of not only our fund balance policies, but obviously as it relates to the golf fund, as it relates to what we'll be talking about in the next few months, which is pension contributions and development of a plan for making those contributions over the coming several years. And I think it tees us up well. We don't normally jump this deep into discussions of budgetary numbers right away at the beginning of the fiscal year. But I think this sets us up for a stronger conversation over the next several months that lead us into what our next budget development cycle is going to look like starting this summer. And as we look at what our fund balance policies stipulate and how we achieve them, I think there is value in reconsidering those figures. And I'm not talking about the dollar figures, but the kind of the lines of demarcation of what you are seeking to retain or maintain in reserve, and how that relates to a series of other things, which are our capital expenses and what we anticipate we're going to need, how much we legitimately draw down from fund balance. If we create a vehicle and equipment replacement fund, is now the time to do that. These are all things that we've had conversations about kind of on an individual case-by-case basis. But as we sit here tonight and start talking about the golf club, it in my ears rings, this is the opportunity for us really to perhaps take a beat and say, all right, well, let's look at our financial policies overall. And let's make sure that they're all married to one another and they all support one another in terms of their the outcome that we're seeking. We know our capital needs are growing. We know we have operational costs that we're doing everything we can to limit growth of. And we know that there are things outside of our control that are impacting the overall health of our budget. And so I think as I've been jotting notes down, there have been a lot of really thoughtful, helpful comments made tonight that while we're having this discussion focused on the golf club, I think it gives us the chance to take a step back and look at the rest of it too, and how they all tie back together. But there's no right answer for that in the moment, but I think it certainly shines a light on it.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I think it's something for us to, tying everything together would be very helpful, because it does seem, to Gary's point, to what you just said, that it's hard to piece it all together.
You don't want it to be an ad hoc feeling, that all of these things impact something else. And I think as and President Levin's comments too, from the standpoint of actions of prior boards that perhaps set us down a path that we want to stay true to that as best as we can with current circumstances taken into account. And all of the component pieces, Trustee Rubin, your comment early on, that if the golf club was a park district facility, it's entirely likely that a component of the park district's tax levy may go to support the day-to-day operations of that golf course. That's a fairly standard model for a park district facility. We don't utilize that model, and yet there are indirect ways that we do. And I think that was also your point, Trustee Rubin, that while there perhaps isn't a specific line item in the village's budget that says for the golf course, we've done things, obviously, utilizing village resources over these last 15 or so years to get us to the point right now where we're having a conversation about should these loans and deferrals be forgiven. And that is a support of the golf club, and I think an important one. So again, all of this really does tie together fairly tightly, and over these next several months, especially as we are working our way out of the pandemic and hopefully looking to brighter futures overall, as we start to think about, and it's hard to say this out loud, and I'm sure the staff will all shudder, as we start thinking about preparing the next budget, even though we just started this one, these conversations are the most important ones we're going to have as we build that next budget, because I think it's setting us up to rethink a bit of the structure of how we have built that budget in the past and what it may start to look like in the future. So with that, I'll stop talking.
And just the policy conversation. So when we go through the policies.
And let me add to all that one of the things we really need to think about right now, which goes to the heart of what you were just saying, is prior boards haven't taken it on, but there was a lot of thought process that every other golf course that we compete with that's a park district course is supported by the tax levies of the park district. Ours is far more successful, so we've gotten it to where it is now. But there's no real reason, if we think about how to do it right and what our responsibilities are, that we don't do just as we do with the water plant. The employees of the part of our golf course are really employees of the village. When we make expenditures, whether it comes out of cash flow from the golf course or cash flow from the village that are necessary to maintain the parks, it's no different than when we do things to maintain the water plant and that sort of thing. And we need really to make sure that the board is thinking in terms and understanding the village has a very important support role in this. And artificially, we've ignored that for a long period of time. But I think this may be the time in which we need to think about how we report and do things on a little different basis going forward in order to sustain the entire program of getting this financed and done. So all of that are things that in staff's infinite spare time, Now that we're just starting the one budget, it's got to be thinking about how we handle all of this in the next budget. Okay, didn't mean to keep us any.
Did Larry disappear? Oh, no, he just got on. So I suppose so are we looking out for direction in terms of how to actually write this thing down? I'm in favor of the 15-year unless there's a downside to spreading it out over longer from an appearance, from how it affects the fund balance. But again, to the points we've just talked about, I think we want to truly understand what that fund balance means and what our policies ought to be around it.
I'm concerned about I'm thinking about this from opposite poles. On the one hand, we have the fundraising. On the other hand, we have our bond rating. And then I guess, well, to make a triangle out of the thing, if I'm going to stick with the analogy, you've got transparency to the residents. And to your point, Jonathan, if you really have decided you're never going to collect this money, then what's it doing on your balance sheet as a receivable? And why are you telling your residents in an accounting report, in an economic report that you're going to publish, that there's this receivable that doesn't exist? On the other hand, the fact of the matter is the cash is sitting in the bank. It's a question of nothing's really changed. We're talking about how we're putting it in financial reports for various purposes. So I think as long as we make it clear what it is and what it isn't to the people of the village and the kind of discussions we've had, including the support for the golf course, that again, if this is part of the park district, would presumably just be day-to-day normal. Well, of course, we're going to support the golf course. Why is this conversation any different? Why is anybody concerned that it needs to be different? So I think the more we adapt some of the reporting that we currently have without making too much of a hassle for Nikki and others into our regular reports, like we do the water fund, maybe the easier it'll be. But we as a board have to think about it as that money is not coming back. And now how should we describe what we've decided to do by way of the earmarks, which is what this really is. I guess just the last point, and I apologize. If 15 years helps us with our bond rating, God bless the people who do the bond rating. It's be surprising to people like you and me, Jonathan, that makes a difference. But if it does, great. As long as it doesn't hurt us with our fundraising. Otherwise, the opposite end of the spectrum is the only reason we're not writing it off today in whole is the bond rating. So whatever the shortest period doesn't hurt us with the bond rating.
According to, from what Stella has said, according to the professional fundraisers, it doesn't matter. We have a plan. 15 years is a plan. So.
But I'm sorry, I meant to say, I misspoke. I meant to say, what's the shortest period that doesn't hurt our bond rating that we can write this off?
What we were advised was 10.
Then I'm in Jonathan's camp and say 10 is my recommendation.
I said 15, but I'm fine with 10.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
To be honest, I don't think it matters all that much, either one. So let's do 10.
I have a penny if you want me to flip a coin. I don't have an opinion.
You're the coin flip, so whatever you decide.
That makes as much sense as anything I've said, certainly. and more
Well,
so.
everything you guys are saying, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds right. And I'm, so I don't know that I have an opinion on it.
If you think about a
Joe,
donor,
you're
I think
not, good, thank you. I'm
more
glad you're,
comfortable with shorter number.
I'm sorry, I was just going to solicit Joe's view on this, considering especially what you do for a living.
No, I was saying like solicit people for money would on the or that I will be calling in for money. I think they'll have a greater sense of confidence of a shorter number than a longer number in terms of debt relief. I mean, it's a pretty myopic way to look at it, because I think the other things are more important in terms of bond rating and the optics around that. But if we can maintain the bond rating and do it on a shorter schedule, I think the odds are higher that we'll have more success in fundraising.
I would just, to the extent that my opinion has any value, I think the shortest period possible is the appropriate way to do it, both for fundraising and for having a fair report for all other purposes, including financial. So I favor 10.
Let's go forward with 10.
We can develop a policy around that for the committee to review next month, and then move forward at that point. Once you are comfortable with the language, and there would be a formal recommendation to the board to adopt it as a policy at a board meeting after that. But why don't, instead of moving ahead with that, I think given the amount of discussion tonight, it warrants bringing it back to you next month and at the committee level. And we take a step after that if the committee's comfortable.
What are we bringing back? Sorry.
We need to establish policy from the standpoint of the forgiveness. If it's going to happen, we want to have that as a formal policy that the board ultimately adopts.
I think that's what we want is to go forward with a 10-year schedule.
Okay. Well, all I was saying was, if you want to see the policy structure before the village board sees it, we can have it on both the finance committee and the village board agenda in the same week in February.
Oh, okay. As long as it's going, let's just get it.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. If what we can do is we can have it on both agendas, and then if the committee is comfortable with it, then it's already on the board's agenda for consideration 2 days later.
And I'll assume that we're going to be comfortable with it, but
okay,
that works.
We'll work toward that.
And Chair Vree, the other piece that I'm hearing is going to come back before you is a further discussion on a golf club fund balance policy, as well as the general fund.
I mean, I think even talking about it, and we've talked about it a lot, but talking about it the same way we talk about water, just the way Gary mentioned, where we've got the, even having the red and blue and green pieces and simplifying, because part of it is the piece of the finance committee report that's golf is really long. And I mean, the checks and stuff like that. We don't, Joe, are you guys reviewing all of that stuff in golf committee?
Yeah, we will. I unfortunately missed last night's meeting, but still, I don't know if we did last night, but
is that a standard part of the review at golf?
Yeah, the standard meeting is a review of the financials. So I go over all of the major points of revenue and expenses and review where we are, compared to budget, and also compared to last year's and actuals. Just a pretty detailed overview of our financial status for the month.
I was gonna say, if anything, still, it's almost too much detail, but it's nice because you can get pretty granular on things that are, we can get down to line items and really look for trends and for things that seem.
And my point is just more, we want somebody reviewing all that stuff. And if you guys are doing it, well, it'd be good for us to see all the summaries. And so we can have conversations about whether it's, capital or just big picture capital. I mean, you guys say this is what you need. And then how does that all fit sort of the way we do with water, where, we have to spend a certain amount of water. We're not judging whether or not we can spend it. We're just judging how do we spend it, and or is it feasible? And so things like that are more big picture as opposed to all the granular stuff that you guys are doing anyway would be very helpful. And that's sort of Gary talked about.
And for next month's report, we can take a stab at trying to incorporate that. I imagine it's going to be kind of an iterative process,
Yeah.
similar to how the report is now. But we can certainly start that next month.
If it takes a couple months, that's fine. I mean, it doesn't need to be done right away. We're still getting all the numbers. It's just how we look at them. So don't kill yourself to get that stuff.
Okay.
Jonathan, I'm guessing that the most interesting part would be the operating versus, say, the versus capital improvements, right?
Yeah, and just sort of top line, how number, how's top line looking? What are the expenses? What are we spending in capital? How are we going to do it? I mean, pretty high level things that we can actually talk about. And then how much is coming to the? I mean, I think how much is also coming to the village if we're going to do that sort of management fee. That just what's that amount? What's going out to Cook County? Some of the bigger picture things that's what would be, I think, most helpful for us.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, anything else from Nikki? Anything that you guys need from us, or otherwise?
No, I think we got some good feedback tonight. Thank you.
All right. Do I have to? Oh, were there any public comments during the meeting?
We did not receive any public comments, no.
Okay. All right. If there is nothing else,
I just want to make one other comment. Again, Nikki and Stella, both, thank you very much for the modifications that we saw to that last page chart, and also for the additional information and the explanation that you provided pretty much with no notice whatsoever. So that was very impressive, and thank you.
Thank you.
okay. Anything else? All right. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. I think we're all in favor.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night,
Good night.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thursday. Thanks.
See you Thursday. Bye-bye.